Okay. Hi, everyone. So welcome to our 12th session of the MedAI group exchange sessions. This week, we have Garrett Honke here with us to talk about his research at X, the Moonshot factory, on EEG representation learning using variational autoencoders and the real-world constraints for its deployment. Garrett is a neuroscientist working as a senior research scientist at X, the Moonshot factory, which was formerly Google X. And he works with projects that generally involve ML, data science, and human-emitted data. So thanks so much, Garrett, for joining us today. Before we start, do you have any preferences on how you'd like to take questions? Would you like us to interrupt you, or would you like
please interrupt as much as possible. It probably won't be much of a talk if you don't. So please, please interrupt.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. So let's try to make this session as interactive as possible. So feel free to ask all your questions. And without further ado, the floor is all yours, Garrett. Take it away.
Thanks. I'm Garrett Honke. I work at X, and I'm going to talk about a project and one particular piece of research that we packaged up as a result of that project. These are sort of the general buckets of things that I thought we might be interested in talking about. This is Amber background. That's the name of the project that spun out this research. Our EEG β-VAE work, the sort of broad topic of what X is and what we do. And then another topic that might be particularly interesting to your audience, which is how do we actually build models for the real world as opposed to for NeurIPS? Which is probably the thing that I learned the most about working on this. So any of those are up for grabs, and please shout out. I think I'm going to start with number 2, just because it seems like it jives a little bit more with the forum, and we can go from there if that sounds okay.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so this work was part of a project incubated at X, where we sought to develop a new objective monitoring tool for mental health disorders. We can talk a little bit more about the project after this if there's interest. Yeah. So here's our standard boilerplate, why this is a problem. Mental health disorders are a major cause of disease burden in the world, and the diagnostic and monitoring tools that we have at our disposal are outmatched to solve it. A big part of the Amber project was to evaluate these laboratory claims that certain physiological signals could function as objective biomarkers for severity of disease or other diagnostic factors at scale. Generally the principle or the aspirational goal of most machine learning applications in this space. So one signal that we investigated and was, at least at the start of the project, the main vector by which we hope to build these tools was electrophysiology. So just as a short primer, your brain generates electrical signals. Those propagate to the scalp, and they can be recorded in a non-invasive way with electrodes to varying degree of success and noise reduction, depending on your approach. So there's a lot of evidence across a broad range of diseases that EEG can be an objective diagnostic and monitoring tool, but it's not easy to collect. There's a lot of real-world constraints, and particularly when you're talking about a problem that needs diagnostic information from vulnerable clinical populations. If you're building a tool for humanity, it might be easy if you're sort of targeting that sort of average human in that approach, and it might be a lot harder if you're talking about a subpopulation. And so as those sort of volumes of that class shrink, your problem gets a little bit harder, is the point I'm making here. So we had this goal to develop a system that could robustly extract relevant interpretable biomarker correlates and potentially learn new ones with as little data as possible. The learning should not be tied to any diagnostic criteria. Probably could have used a little bit more scaffolding here, but let me just say, since reliability is low on the diagnostic criteria and subjective, and the disease taxonomy changes over time. So I'll unpack that a little bit, since I've got more than 5 minutes from this NeurIPS talk, or sorry, ICLR. The issue here, and you may all already be familiar with this, so just bat me down and tell me everybody is well aware of the problem, is that even if you take two professional clinicians in this field who have been, decades of experience, what you might find is that they agree about 70% of the time, right? The reliability between their diagnostics, at least according to one study, might be about 70%. And so already, if you're looking for your gold label data, you've got 30% error in what you think is the ground truth. Part of the issue that we might get into discussing a little bit is that in addition to building a model where you expect that you must have some ground truth to create a discrimination that will be useful in the world, you also have to grapple with the issue that people don't necessarily agree with what the disease taxonomy is. And it's actually quite variable when you're dealing with these broad axis 1 disorders, like what we colloquially call depression or anxiety. So within depression, there are classes of diseases that are at least better defined than depression overall. And there are even arguments that the overall label depression should just not be used. And what we should do is strive for a little bit more specificity about what people actually experience. And in some cases, an argument is being made for sort of looking at the symptoms instead of the label as a way to get around some of this issue, because at least we know that at the symptom level, we can have some information from the individual about exactly what they are experiencing or their clinician. So that's the idea. And to test this idea that this diagnostic criteria is low in reliability and subjective, and the disease taxonomy changes over time, we look to, oh, sorry, that would have been helpful. So yeah, we developed a two-step pipeline here: unsupervised representation learning to denoise and extract these biomarker correlates, and then a fast supervised mapping on top of that pre-trained representation, so that we could actually map some labels to our lower level sort of sensory representation, if you will, without all of the issues that we run into with these labels. So we focus our work on a core symptom of depression, and that is anhedonia. Just as adding to the broader context here, we had, in addition to this task, 10 other tasks that we were looking at that focused on different symptoms, but what we'll talk about for the ICLR paper is just anhedonia. And since we know that the waveform morphology typically differs between people experiencing anhedonic symptoms and healthy controls, we can use it as an important validation test for the effectiveness and interpretability of this approach. And so again, anhedonia is the lack of pleasure or interest in previously pleasurable stimuli or activities. Emotionally salient stimuli will evoke a late positive potential. This is just a stereotyped deflection of the waveform in EEG. And this positive deflection is attenuated or absent in individuals who are experiencing anhedonia, which is one of the core symptoms of this umbrella term that we'll use for the rest of the talk, depression.
Can I ask a quick question here?
Yes.
So when you say anhedonia, is it self-reported, or does
yes.
is that a clinical?
Yeah. So we do not look for people experiencing the symptoms. That would be very difficult for recruitment, but it is of the most common symptoms. So the way that we get these labels is with what's called a structured clinical interview from the DSM-5. So SCID is the acronym there that you hear. And that is the gold standard across psychiatry, right? You sit down with your clinician, you have a series of conversations potentially, but at least one. And often these are facilitated with sort of like a checklist-based interview structure. And as you sort of tick off marks on that checklist, it is more likely that you get a certain diagnostic criteria applied to that collection of symptoms that the clinician has observed or heard about. And so what we're talking about here when I'm talking about my labels are explicitly these clinical interviews with a licensed psychiatrist. And in addition to that, we could talk about this a little bit more in depth, but if you're familiar with the Beck Depression Inventory, the BDI, the HAM-D, we basically took every single paper-based questionnaire in addition to these structured clinical interviews.
Got it. Okay.
So we had a very, very deep bench of data that we could rely on. Though for packaging up this research, we're talking about the SCID and EEG only. Yeah.
I see. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, I have a related question actually.
Yeah.
I understand like this evaluation for creating the ground truth is like based on the structured questionnaire, but how did you select the cohort for the interview?
Yeah, so the data set as a whole, I'll just talk outside the scope of this paper for a second. We had 1,500 folks with neuro and behavioral and questionnaire-based data. These were recruited across a number of partner universities, upwards of 6. And in the case of the data that I'm talking about today, this is like your classic psychology study recruitment.
No, I understand. Like, did you had like any basic like criteria for the recruitment? Like they have to be adult or they have to have certain conditions for the recruitment?
The full data set had children and adults, so there were no criteria there. As far as trying to get matched samples of healthy controls and individuals that are experiencing whatever arbitrary disorder, we did do a initial screening with the BDI to make sure that they would meet that criteria on the sort of pathology side, right? And on the healthy control side, we might have been a little sloppy in terms of, like, say, if an individual had something that we would not consider in the family of this disorders, like I guess a good example would be schizophrenia or something like that, which is obviously very low in the population. They would still be considered, I think, a healthy control for the respect of this study. Those are like so few and far between that it didn't show up a lot. But there was a little bit of comorbidity. This is an interesting thing that we could actually talk about. It's really hard to get a sample of people that don't have high comorbidity between anxiety and depression. So when I'm talking about folks with depression, they might also be positive for anxiety. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, one of the beauties of this approach is that we aren't driving the representation learning toward those labels, right? So we're not bound to a representation that is good at separating people with anxiety or not, or people with depression and not. And so I think that we get around some of the issue of the comorbidity by using this unsupervised pipeline. Yeah. Great. Any other questions before I go on?
And how many lead do you have in your EEG?
So this was like an ActiChamp 32 channel. Was the baseline. As another part of this project, we also developed our own cap because we didn't expect that it would be easy enough to use a wet electrode setup in say like your primary care physician's office, which is what ultimately we expected the venue to be for deploying this technology. And so the cap that we set up was a dry electrode cap with 3 electrodes along the midline, PZ, FZ, CZ. And we could talk a little bit more about that. Ultimately, we used the brain vision, like class, what you'd expect for any lab off the shelf, but not super dense, right? 32 channels is not a ton. Okay. Yeah. Great. Okay. Okay, so just talking a little bit about the methodology here. We start by presenting the participants with pairs of neutral and positive images to capture this anhedonic effect, and recording the resulting EEG activity. We only used 3 sensors of this 32 sensor cap. And the main motivation there is that in addition to sort of doing this research, we're also de-risking a product that would be far easier and quicker to set up. And so we sort of intentionally ablated the density of the dimensionality of the data that we had so that we could better mirror what we expected our conditions to be in the real world. So that's the argument for just using those 3 data from those 3 electrodes. And this is the data that we use for the unsupervised learning of a disentangled representation, ZX, using this beta variational autoencoder. Can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Yes, we can
Great.
see it.
Yeah. So just to sort of walk us through this, we show images to the participants. They are either neutral, or in this case, we're only using the positive images. This is another very interesting discussion point, I think, that we might like to talk about. This presentation gives us a bunch of EEG data, and what you see here is condition-defined EEG data. So the blue line would be the neutral, and the red line would be the positive. Not sure if I've got those labels exactly right. We present that information to our model, the β-VAE. We do an encode, just like you might be familiar with. We have the reparameterization trick where we sample from a distribution of learned parameters, and we decode, and on the out, you get the β-VAE reconstruction, or the AE reconstruction. Just to sort of ground you to my figure here, these tan boxes in our diagram are going to be the β-VAE, or the AE baseline. The gray boxes are going to be our symbol concept association network. Black lines are going to be a training pathway. Red lines are going to be classification. Purple lines are going to be post-hoc classification analysis.
Another quick question. So is
Yes,
the input
please.
to your variational autoencoder a spectrogram, or is it the raw EEG?
Not a spectrogram.
Okay.
We could talk about spectral domain if anyone is interested. We did a lot of work in that, and never really found that the added complexity was worth the effort of adding the frequency and including the frequency domain with our time domain representation. So yes, what the input was a 3D visualization where on the channel axis, you could consider it almost identical to an image, right? Mm-hmm. We had 3 channels of electrodes. You usually have 3 channels of an image. So for all intents and purposes, it's identical, right? The height and width channels are just the activation over time and the amplitude. And then the volume, or the third channel axis was the actual channel of the electrode. Forgive me if I mix up electrode and channel, and please ask for clarification if I start doing that. Yeah.
And how many images you are showing per user?
How many images? Mm-hmm. So depending on our thresholding, which was quite low touch, given that one of the main things we wanted to show here was that we could put noisy EEG in, mm-hmm. You would get about at the most 60, and what that ultimately amounted to was about 42 per on average per condition. So 42 positive, 42 negative. So okay. So quite low in terms of normal ERP regimes. I realize I haven't said ERP yet, and it's all over the place. So really quickly, EEG, what we've been talking about, these signals that you can collect at the scalp, ERPs are just averages over a time-blocked stimulus presentation. And the idea, and sort of the classic research from the psychophysics literature, is that if you want to get the cleanest possible signal to use to do your analysis, ideally you average over many presentations that reflect a similar class, and then use that average representation to do your inferential statistics. So if you want to know if a waveform in one condition is higher than another in a different condition, ideally you would use the ERP representation, because the noise inherent to EEG is so high that it would be more difficult to get a read without this averaging technique that allows the noise to drop out.
There's also one question from the audience, I think. Anjali, do you want to ask your question yourself, or I can read it out for you? Okay, so the question is, does neural versus positive vary by subject? Like the example is, like, could blue skies be positive and a roller coaster be scary?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Surely it does. I think like being, so there's a few things there. One is that the images are highly normed. IOPS is the International Effective Picture System, and used in many studies of this effect and more broadly. So there's a lot of normalization. I do agree there is a chance so that this office image, for example, maybe terrifies me. It's supposed to be neutral. And so you can see that like there would be idiosyncratic effects like this. I agree. I think that we're banking on the idea that we show enough images to get a read of the phenomenon without that. There is another class of images in IOPS that I'm not showing here, which are the negative images. We had a heck of a time designing the product specifications for using these pictures, because the laboratory findings, by and large, use much more salient emotional stimuli than these pictures. So we completely dropped the negative affect stimuli because we were worried that we could not present those images in a way that was safe for people in the context of the study, right? We did not want to cause any harm. The standard effect is often sort of a collection of like gruesome crime scene photos, and on the negative affect, and on the positive affect, people often use pornography. And so those were two things that we thought were strictly outside the bounds of what we could do for a number of reasons. The main one being is that we don't have a clinician. We did not intend or expect that we could have a clinician on site to address any adverse consequences like you might in a psychology lab. So that's the first place I'd say where this was quite a diversion from what you'd expect in a typical psychology, psychopathology research context, is that we weren't using these like incredibly evocative images. We were using the sort of pared down version. So babies, theme parks, and then on the neutral side, just kind of very bland, as bland as they could be images. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Okay. Sorry, this would have been a little bit nicer to see. Yeah, so we show that once trained, the β-VAE can reconstruct these ERPs even from single novel EEG trials, thus reducing the need for lengthy recording sessions for the potentially vulnerable participants in the future. So the point that I'm making here and in this slide is that when we have the ERP inputs and train the β-VAE on the ERPs, we find that the reconstructions are actually quite nice, even at single trial. So if you train on ERPs and then present just single EEG trajectories, we found that we got pretty good results on the denoising side. So this was something I put in the column of a success for this idea that we could use this as a sort of denoising technique with very few priors, like what you might expect from the typical lab context, where you might have a grad student go through and look at every single epoch of your EEG data and make sure that there are no artifacts that are not caught by your more simple strategies like amplitude threshold cutoffs and other things that are shown to kind of, when you use those amplitude thresholds, you sort of lose a bit of your data that otherwise you should hold on to. So this was pretty exciting. It was one of the early validations of this, just that like, even just getting a flat baseline from completely raw EEG was really exciting. It didn't excite very many people that were like purely from the ML side, because they would just say like, yeah, you could just make that 0, no big deal. So it was pretty exciting for me coming from the psych side, just to see that we're actually reproducing a baseline that would look acceptable for me looking at ERPs, even though they were single trajectories of EEG. So we were pretty stoked about that. Right, so once that representation learning is done, we freeze the β-VAE and train the symbol concept association network to reconstruct these K-hot classification labels while grounding that label representation ZY into the corresponding EEG representation ZX. So the idea is we just train a simple autoencoder that has discrete units, K-hot, for everything that you're interested in. So age might be adult and child, gender, male, female, depression, yes, no, site, one of the 4 collection sites that we included for this study. Axis 1 is another label for a broad class of psychopathology disorders, the most frequent ones that occur in the population. Yes, no, axis 1. And As you can see, we trained the decoder. I mean, this is a very simple beta variational autoencoder with discrete labels. And we expect that if we have done a decent job in finding models that are well disentangled, that these two representations will be pretty easy to bind. There won't be a lot of weight movement here to create the binding between our raw EEG or ERP input and our discrete label encoding system. Just pause here for a sec if anybody has any questions. This is like the whole meat of the model.
Right, I have one quick question. So why do you need to include sight for the encoder?
Oh yeah, well, so sight is probably the noisiest factor in EEG. And that is just because maybe like, so let's just start with line noise. If someone is just sort of more close to a 120 volt outlet in their lab than in another lab, and your labels are just a little skewed toward that other lab, the model is going to learn that the label depends on that line noise, right? And so sight is really important to partial out, I think, as a part of this full component, because God forbid there's a fluorescent light or something that's a little bit too close to your recording, you're going to get that. And you know, you can obviously do simple things.
That would probably limit your use of your system or whatever, like the cap in any other site that doesn't really have that previous reconstruction.
That's the beauty of this, I believe, is that whatever labels you have in the future and whatever you would like to do in terms of partialing out noise, you can rewire this network to a new set of discrete labels. And so if you think that sight is a concern, you're free to include that along with sort of new evolutions in the taxonomy of the disease or anything else, any labels that you bring to the table. Once you have the EEG representation part locked down, your scan network is completely arbitrary in terms of what labels you'd like to include. So I don't think, I mean, I certainly think this limits the generalizability of the study writ large, because sight is important. It's a sort of, in some sense, the nature of the beast of using EEG. And there are so many other variables, I think, that come into play in terms of sight, right? We're talking about huge research teams, different customs in terms of the lab, different ideas about when you should stop recording and go in and like work on a electrode site for a little. I'm not sure how familiar y'all are with the nitty gritty of this, but if usually what you have is a few technicians watching the EEG scroll while it's happening. And anytime that you sort of see something go off the charts, what happens in nearly every session, you stop the session and you go in and you like, you know, tap the electrode or do whatever you have to do to sort of make it come back into normalcy. And so I'm not sure how, if your goal is to build a product that uses EEG to do something useful in the world, I'm not sure how you get around the fact that the collection circumstances are going to vary widely. And yeah, I mean, this is one of the chief concerns of the project as a whole, was that we're going to go into a place where people aren't watching the scroll, watching the EEG scroll. We're going to go into a place where they don't know what they're looking at. And it has to be as easy as sort of running on a treadmill and blowing a ball, like a cardiac stress test. And
I was just a little bit concerned about these two variables, especially like the sight and the depression, because I don't know like how, like sight, of course, you can correct it reliably, but like just the generalizability part on a large scale study, like I don't know how that sight variable can be input, and the depression part also, that if you need the depression just for generating the scan reconstruction, and it has to be then probably kind of accurate. And if it is just self-reported depression, I don't know like if it can have the same effect for scan reconstruction.
So it's structured clinical interview is how you get the depression label, which is still squirrely, not super well defined. But yeah, I mean, I think you're raising concerns about the use of EEG for anything like this.
Right.
And I guess I'll just reiterate that you can bring your own symbol concept association network.
I just want to understand that, do you see that the scan reconstruction without using this variable, does it have the same effect, or really this variable helps you to improve your scan reconstruction hugely?
That's interesting. So the loudest discrete variables here that I would say are important are age and sight.
Okay.
So I would disregard. So the effect size of what we're talking about when we're talking about depression is literally nothing. It's very, very small, right? And it doesn't happen in all the people who have that label. So the beauty of this is essentially that if you have that problem, make a better symbol concept association network, like use different labels, but you don't have to throw away the part that actually does the EEG re-representation, right? The EEG encoding. Whatever you would like to test, if you have a well enough, a generalizable enough β-VAE for encoding the EEG, then it doesn't really affect that representation at all if whatever your scan labels are poor quality. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense.
Great.
Oh, I actually have one other question. So the way you are binding the scan encoder's representation and the EEG representation is via KL divergence. Do you is there a pro and con for this metric particularly, especially since your inputs to the two autoencoders are very different in dimensionality?
Yeah. Sometimes we talk about, this is a really good point. I think that sometimes we talk about these things in terms of like how much art and how much science they are. And in this case, I would suggest that we have not done everything that we need to do to evangelize this model, and we're very far on the art side. So when there's a step in here that we haven't talked about, which is that you need to achieve some semblance of disentanglement. So if you're not familiar with disentanglement, it's as simply as I could say it, it's the idea that the way that I partition the space and the re-representation of this data is going to be consistent run to run. And there is some sort of prior or something in the world that actually represents this in a way that is disentangled. And if we train enough models and compare them, then we will eventually find the commonalities, and we will choose a model that does a good job in representing the sort of like point-to-point correspondences in that multidimensional space. And so that is an art. Like choosing that model is an art. Deciding what you're going to, what value you're going to use for beta is an art. Deciding when to stop is an art. And I don't think there are a lot of great rules out there, if you haven't done this, 15 or 20 times, that allow you to get that insight to know like you're done now, or you're not done, or you're not doing a good job at all. So that's a pretty big barrier to entry. I was lucky enough to work on this with Irina Higgins, who invented the technique, and so we weren't lacking for advice and expertise on the art side there. And my training was in psychology, but in autoencoders, neural networks in PhD. So I didn't exactly come to this fresh, and still it was pretty critically important to have someone who understood the behavior of these models well enough to pick the right models in terms of disentanglement. I don't know what the alternative is. Maybe just like a fully connected, like a binding layer. Yeah. The KL, the coefficient on KL is really an art, and I learn something every time I see one of our collaborators do it. But essentially, that is a sweep over, maybe 0, so nothing at all, or 1, which would just be a standard variational autoencoder, up to 20 or 30. And then essentially what they do is just sort of like lower the range until you start to feel like what you are seeing is a little bit more consistent. But again, I think it's firmly on the art side. I think there are like information theoretic ways to analyze these things, but yeah, it's an art.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so once both models are trained, we can classify a new EEG signal by presenting it to the EEG encoder and predicting the labels using SCAN. What we showed in the paper was that this deep representation learning results in better classification accuracy compared to the baseline commonly used to diagnose depression. I sort of want to call out here that as far as baselines go, there are a few stronger ones that you probably could have had in this case. Just when I say the commonly used baseline, what I mean is that the researchers will create these ERPs, right? They take a bunch of EEG recordings, they average over them. Now you've got an EEG ERP for every condition that you have in the experiment, and then you take the delta. And that differs all over the place in the EEG signal. And so one prior that you, if you're a responsible researcher, that you should apply is that I know that this effect should probably only happen in this window because the signal could not propagate from an individual's eyes to the part of the brain that I need to get the processing done that I expect is happening at a shorter time. So you constrain where you look in the EEG signal based on these prior knowledge about what we know about the stereotyped morphology of the waveform. And so that is the standard, the lab-based standard is make your ERP and take the delta. And if the delta is large, that person is not depressed. And if the delta is small, that person is depressed. So we've got a long way to go, I'd say, even on the lab side for making something that takes, even just starts to make use of the multidimensionality of the signal, where essentially you're reducing this 5,000 or so scalar vector down to a single scalar that you hope is going to be something like a temperature indicator. If you're at 100, you've got a little bit of a fever. If you're at 98.6, you're probably okay. And so that is the sort of the laboratory driven approach. And so when I talk about baseline, that's essentially what I'm talking about. Okay, so in addition to all this stuff that you would expect from any classifier, discriminative or generative, with SCAN, we can also get an interpretable insight into what information the model is using for its diagnosis by visualizing its learned prior. So here we see that depression, at least in this run over these 780 odd individuals, is represented by information on a single latent dimension, this Z8 here, while the other dimensions are irrelevant for this classification. When we visualize the samples produced by our model, we see that they are similar to those from the real data. So for example, the no depression samples have a pronounced difference between the red and the blue electrodes, while the corresponding, which correspond to responses when viewing the neutral and positive images. And this difference is missing in the depressed cohort. So this verifies, or at least it provides some early evidence for us, that SCAN diagnosis of depression is grounded in the known biomarker of depression, anhedonia. However, in our case, this biomarker was automatically discovered by the β-VAE through unsupervised learning, and SCAN was able to correctly and automatically pick this biomarker as necessary for the diagnosis of depression. The full system allowed us to visualize this discovery, and hence the combination of β-VAE and SCAN has this exciting promise of helping clinicians discover new biomarkers of clinical disorders in the future. And that, I think, is the real take home for the entire project, which is that we could start to attempt to find new things that we did not expect or did not immediately go looking for from the prior literature as a new approach to monitoring and diagnosing these mental disorders. So there's a lot we don't know, but approaches like this do allow us to start to see what changes in the actual waveform might correspond to changes in our samples. So just to summarize here, we demonstrated for the first time that disentangled representation learning can be successfully applied to EEG data. These representations can be used to predict multiple clinical factors through fast supervised learning. And we've outperformed this typical baseline from the field. And more importantly, when we use in combination with SCAN, it allows for this interpretable classification. And that suggests that our model can be useful as a tool for clinicians gaining a better understanding of the clinical conditions in the future. Great, so that's sort of what I have for the full thing. If we want to talk about this for a little bit more, I'd love to. We could talk about some of the other things. Up to y'all.
Could I ask a question to see if I'm getting it? So then would the next step then be instead of putting in depression as your into your SCAN model, you would put anhedonia and psychomotor retardation and insomnia and ADHD or something like that, and then run it again and see if something else correlated with those things?
That would be incredible. The symptom-driven approach, I think, is the only way to go. I really, yes. So yes, the answer is yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. Do you think as you add more symptoms or more factors, all those art, hyperparameters and things like that are going to vary a lot what you need, or do you think it's now that you've got it tuned that you can use the same thing?
So the assumption is that your symbols, your discrete labels, are going to be a poor yet still consistent approximation of the raw data. And so I think, so I would like to believe that the graduate student descent that you need to do to get the right parameters more apply to the domain than to the labels. And so if the domain is the way that psychopathology manifests in the neural substrate, then I would like to think that is what you're tuning. And so if you add another symptom, I would not expect that you have to do a bunch of work in disentangling. But I guess the pessimist in me says, like, every time you do anything in this domain, it is always different. And that is the hard road to productization of these things. Is that the consistency is so low across even the things that you have the most confidence in being consistent. Sorry, that's sort of a yes and no, but yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I'm just curious, do you, so in this project, do you actually find potential new biomarkers, or do you, or are those representation actually correspond to like existing biomarkers?
So on the project, we truly exhausted about everything you could have done to this data. And we did not create a team to specifically go after particularly stereotyped morphology differences in the EEG signal and do that discovery. And that would have been a really cool research direction. And I think that would have been pretty strong validation or stronger validation of this whole enterprise. But it was a bit too far on the research side for us. And so no, we didn't. But in terms of what we did look at, we looked at raw EEG, we looked at ERPs, we looked at resting state EEG. We used every technique that we could find. On the team and on the authors list were several experts in affective neuroscience that had a really good handle on the literature. And so we looked at, like, Shannon information in the resting state EEG under this idea that there's sort of more entropy in individuals that suffer from psychopathology. And we looked at sort of twin networks where we encoded both conditions or all conditions of the tasks, and tried to see how we could possibly leverage a representation like that. We did every discriminative technique that you could imagine from the era. I think, like, the only thing that we really didn't push too hard on was any sort of generative adversarial network. And the only reason why we didn't do that is because if you're already using a VAE, it's a hard argument to go to GAN unless you need a really sharp picture. And in fact, the fuzziness of this reproduction is a design advantage, I think, because we know that there's going to be noise on the amplitude dimension. We know that there's going to be noise on the time dimension, right? The time that it takes for the actual signal to propagate will differ between people. And so we were both enjoying that property of the β-VAE and also using convolution to get around some of these issues that essentially in a psych lab, you will say, this thing, the P300 happens at 300 milliseconds. We're going to look from 300 to 400 milliseconds. And if it's not there, we get a failure to replicate or we don't find the effect. And so that was the advantage, I think, of this. We also looked into the time frequency domain spectral representations. They did not provide much more information than what we had. So yeah, we did not discover a new biomarker here. We tested everyone that we knew and more or less determined that it was not a viable way to solve this problem.
Okay, thanks.
I have another question. So the entire study is based on the 3 electrodes, like you mentioned. So is there like, if it was not for making it generalizable enough to different sites, would you consider adding more channels in, and how would that, like, is it scalable in that dimension?
So let me make sure I understand. When we say site, we mean the university lab in which it was conducted. And I just want to make sure you don't mean channel or electrode site.
Oh,
when
yes,
you
yes.
say site.
So
Yeah.
I assumed that you used 3 because you wanted a universal set of electrodes across all sites.
We used 3 because we thought that we could construct an EEG cap that you could use like a treadmill and a graduated cylinder with a ball in it for the cardiac stress test that you could like throw in the trash when you were done. That is how disposable we wanted the thing to be. We were looking at like paper-based caps to hold the electrodes on, like to the point where I think that we got the full set down to $100.
Oh wow! Okay.
Which was pretty good if you consider like your entry-level setup is going to be in the few thousands range for a not so good one. And you know, starting up a lab, maybe you would spend $50,000 or $100,000 to get your setup, even for like a 32-channel brain vision thing. Yeah.
So in that context, like, if it was not for this constraint that you wanted it to be universally accessible to people, is there a benefit to adding more channels in, and would that scale with the autoencoder? And
yeah, so more channels essentially mean better localization, right? And you need something, you need a symptom that manifests in the neural substrate that is lateralized. So happens on one side or the other side of the brain, I think, to make an argument for why you would want to spend the extra money to use the extra electrodes. That said, you know, I'm a research scientist at Google. Like I would never, if you want to say 256, like 256 is the answer. Obviously, if you want to say 512, like sign me up. And we could have just ablated the data on the back. I mean, that's what we did for this this study, which was all brain vision. But yeah, I don't think that density is a problem. I think it may not be a solution for this because there's no evidence that the late positive potential is lateralized or in need of any spatial localization. It would help you for ICA to better identify, you know, individual components that should be dropped. But we tested with and without ICA for the distinct purpose of making sure that we could be robust to what you get by removing the blinks, for example, which is sort of the main use case I think that people use ICA for. But yeah, the more the better. I'd agree, especially if you're in this sort of exploratory data science realm, right? Like if you actually did want to discover a biomarker, then you probably would want better spatial localization because it's newer on the block than something that has been done for 60 or 70 years, right? Denser arrays, the ability to process them is obviously better than it ever has been. And so if you were on that pure discovery track, I would say pack as many in there as you can get. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'm sure you try other tasks too. So.
Yeah, so just off the top of my head, the IOPS task, flankers, oddball task. Sorry, I can explain these better if needed. We did a self-referential experience task where individuals saw words and sort of the task was just to say how well they apply or don't apply to themselves. If there is a task that has been used with the brain and these particular disorders, I think we had data on it. This was, IOPS was the most fruitful to the point where our research team just sort of converged and said, we're doing IOPS. The other one I didn't mention was a sort of reward positivity task, like the doors task, if you've ever heard this, where essentially it's just like, two-armed bandit, choose a door, you win or lose. That's another thing that we know from extensive literature, sort of depressed, attenuated in individuals with depression. They experience less neural responding to reward. Yeah.
And did you benchmark your ECG data with the standard EEG machines?
Are you talking about the hardware that we built?
Yep.
Yeah. So all of this comes from a standard, like as standard as possible setup. Anything that we did, like reducing the channels, was something that we did post-hoc as a way to line up better to our product need. But 3 or 32 did not make a big difference for this problem. So I guess I would say there was this is the benchmark in as much as it was the state of the art for a psychopathology lab.
No, I mean like comparing with the standard setup in the psychopathology lab, Like,
that is how we collected this data in the standard setup in a psychopathology lab.
Okay, and did you also try this model on the data captured by your CAP or?
Yeah, we did. Yeah. Unfortunately for that, there were human constraints involved in that, as you may know, it takes about an hour or two to successfully do this with one person to get their data. And we set up an experiment at the sort of later stages of the project to confirm that the signal to noise ratio and other factors between our device and these typical devices was acceptable. The result of that work was that yes, in fact, it was comparable and in fact cleaner in a few different ways, mostly due to some innovations that had nothing to do with the hardware, or at least were quite simple. It turns out if you put a mesh cap over the EEG, it makes a huge effect that people just haven't quite used as regularly as maybe they should have, even in the lab. So the whole idea is to stop more of that radiation from the world getting into your electrodes. And so the hardware worked incredibly well. It turned out that asking a human and human technicians to work with the same participant for 4 hours was the hard part. So for our real world data, we didn't get as clean of a comparison as we would have liked, but in any of our sort of hardware and lab-based experiments, everything looked great. We also open sourced all of the hardware and the visualizer software and did something like a non-compete around the patents. So all of that is sort of available if anyone would ever like to pick up the hardware component for the cheapest EEG system ever known to humanity.
We have one more question in the audience from Anjali. And the question is, would it be possible to go into a bit more detail about the other psychology tests that you mentioned and why IAPS worked the best, or why did you select that?
Yeah. So I think that we converged on IAPS from the numbers, which is not a great answer, I know, in terms of something that we actually saw some good lift on when we modeled it. And there's a few things there. One is that it is probably the most well-known, aside from this doors task that I mentioned. And so that was the most interesting angle for IAPS. I could talk about the specific tasks. I could talk about like what they mean, what diseases they load on. I might actually have a yeah, I don't think I have a list. I'm sorry. That was like the one to do that I meant to knock out before this talk that I didn't do. Yeah, why did IOPS work better? I think that like ultimately the task is very important, right? And if there isn't a mechanism that, if there isn't a known brain mechanism that is easily exploitable by a task, then you're in like pure discovery land, right? Pure unsupervised discovery land. And we didn't have a lot of success on that side. So I think that the biggest benefit of IOPS was that we were all like, had super high levels of expertise in it. And in addition to that, it's very easy for us to see in the data. Whereas like entropy, no human could see, right? Sort of randomness in a very random looking thing is going to be a hard thing to extract as a human. And so there were a lot of like, I guess like issues of convenience around why I liked IOPS, is because I came in with pretty strong priors about what I should expect. And for some of the other tasks, maybe if we had a little bit more expertise, it would have been easier to parse the output, and maybe we would have had a little bit more success around those if that was the case. But I do believe that IOPS was sort of was the strongest, and probably even from like a literature search, it would say the same, even in lab-based, in terms of like what you're looking for. Again, the task to disorder match is the thing that matters the most. And so reward positivity, this late positive potential for emotionally evoked stimuli, the error signal that you get in a flankers task, and the sort of self-referential emotion task, all were sort of at the top of my list as tasks that were particularly well suited for the depression classification label. I'll also say that one sort of unexpected thing, including the Axis 1 label, which is, I mentioned this, but it's sort of like the most frequently occurring. The DSM-5 does not have Axis 1 as a criteria, so I'll just say I'm sort of dating myself by using it or bringing it up. But it was interesting to see that the model was doing better than chance at predicting this Axis 1 label. And that suggests to me that like whatever signal processing is happening, we are getting a little bit more of an edge. And so so one caveat I'll just mention there is obviously our depressed folks are included in that label, right? Our anxious folks were included in that label, but we were still doing good over this full 750 odd subject data set for Axis 1 with a model and task that we did not expect should be good for Axis 1, and or at least not as clean as depression. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there to suggest that the model is doing something more than getting the delta at 450 to 550 milliseconds and using a threshold to decide what the label should be.
Thank you. And maybe just to like, do you mind giving us like a quick overview of your projects at Moonshot, or what do you guys do?
Yeah, sure. I can't tell you about anything that I work on right now.
Mm-hmm.
I work for a sort of like a core central team, so I'm not on any one project. I just sort of do early stage support for folks that are setting up a project. And so this is the one that I'm super free to talk about. I would say like we have AI residency internship things available all the time. Don't hesitate to reach out. It's an incredibly dynamic and an interesting place to work. It's right around the corner for you folks who are local or soon to be local. I will, let's see, what else did I have to say about that? Yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if you find an AI residency gig there that looks like it might fit your interests. The viability of health projects is a really interesting question. And I think like the future of them has to be on the scale of nation states to really make an impact in the way that we thought we would make an impact with this project. And so NIH grants, multi-study, multi-year collaborations, like a data bank, the likes of the sort of genome data that the NIMH was sort of directed to over the past 10 years or so. That seems like the scale that you would need to build models and products that address humanity and also are more resilient against the type of biases that we should expect to find in this data. It was collected on a college campus. There's so many things that are biased here. Even the data come in biased, right? So women are more likely to experience psychopathology than men. So already you've got a lot of and there's a lot of questions about whether or not that is a social construct or sort of a more biologically driven issue. And so yeah, I'd say like it has to be very large to do well. And that was ultimately one of the issues for us, is that we just couldn't collect enough data to feel confident that we were making an impact. And clinicians as a whole don't have a problem with diagnostics. They have a problem with monitoring. They have a problem with like understanding what's going on with their patients while they're not in their office. They can use a PHQ-9 or a PHQ-1 with one question, which is, are you depressed, yes or no, to get the diagnostic criteria. And oftentimes that's about as good as a psychiatrist. Sorry to end it there on a sort of complicated note, down note, but.
No, that was great, yeah. So.
Yeah. I'm sorry we don't have more time, because I mean, I'd love to hear about the product, development portion as well, those issues. But great.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Garrett. And I guess there are a lot more questions, but for the sake of time, we'll probably end now. So let's thank Garrett again with some virtual applause. And we'll be uploading the talk on our YouTube channel later today. So if anybody has more questions, you can post them under the video, or we also have a form on our website where we take questions. And so if you can post them there, and then we can follow up with Garrett more about it as well.
Very cool. Don't hesitate to reach out. This was
awesome.
Fun.
Thank you so much.
Garrett.
Bye-bye.
See you guys next week.
Thank you.